Isabella Mitchell had never felt more out of place than the night her father made his announcement. At the grand family gathering, hosted in a ballroom costing more than most people's yearly salaries, surrounded by 50 relatives in lavish attire, her father stood up and, without a hint of emotion, declared that she was being cut from her grandmother's inheritance. His words echoed through the marble walls, sending a chill across the room as every eye turned toward her. "You never deserved it," he said, his voice ringing with authority. The message was clear, and the sting of his words, though harsh, was not unexpected. Isabella, ever composed, simply smiled, raised her champagne glass in mock celebration, and walked out without saying a word. What happened next would be nothing short of shocking. 48 hours later, Isabella's father lost everything. His empire, worth hundreds of millions of dollars, crumbled in an instant. The cause of his fall? A secret her grandmother had taken to her grave. A secret that would change the Mitchell family legacy forever. The Mitchells, known for their real estate empire, had built their fortune from the ground up, starting with Isabella's grandfather's first apartment building in 1962. By the time Isabella was born, their wealth had grown into a multi-million-dollar empire. They lived in a sprawling estate in Connecticut, with staff quarters, a collection of luxury cars, and a wine cellar stocked with rare bottles. Yet, Isabella's place within this world was always tenuous. She was the eldest Mitchell heir, yet she chose a different path. While her younger sister, Victoria, embraced the family business with open arms, Isabella became an art teacher in Brooklyn, far from the glittering world her family inhabited. Her father, Robert Mitchell, never forgave her for this decision. At every family event, he would boast of Victoria's accomplishments, praising her for continuing the family legacy. Meanwhile, Isabella's career, teaching art to teenagers, was dismissed as frivolous. But Isabella's grandmother, Eleanor Hayes Mitchell, had always been different. She saw the value in Isabella's choices, even if no one else did. Every Sunday, Isabella would visit her grandmother's private residence in Westport, not the family estate, to hear her stories, share her artwork, and listen to her wisdom. Eleanor, a former judge, had watched the family dynamics with keen eyes. She knew the importance of legacy, but she also understood the cost of greed and power. Isabella was her confidant, and Eleanor had a message for her that would change everything. "True wealth, Isabella," she told her granddaughter, "isn't measured in square footage or stock portfolios. Your grandfather understood that, but your father has forgotten." What Isabella didn't know at the time was that Eleanor had been carefully documenting the family's behavior, planning a legal strategy that would protect Isabella from the very greed that threatened to destroy her. Eleanor had created a separate estate worth $20 million, which she intended to use as leverage to protect Isabella from her father's oppressive control. Eleanor had one final, crucial piece of advice for her granddaughter. "Promise me, when the time comes, you'll remember every word in this will. Every clause has a purpose." Months later, after Eleanor's death, the family began to squabble over the inheritance. Isabella had always been excluded from these discussions, but Victoria's role as vice president of Mitchell Holdings and her father's growing influence made it clear that Isabella's fate had already been decided. Her father's actions at the family dinners, where he belittled Isabella for her career choices, were only a preview of what was to come. Then, Isabella received a call from James Crawford, her grandmother's attorney. Eleanor had left specific instructions for Isabella, provisions that were triggered by her father's actions. The will was not yet read, but Eleanor had anticipated exactly what would happen: the public humiliation of her granddaughter. The legal clause Eleanor had put in place was a masterpiece of strategy, designed to ensure that Isabella would not be silenced by her father's wealth and power. The will reading was set for the evening of the family's gala at the Ritz-Carlton. Isabella arrived in a simple black dress, nothing extravagant, while her father and sister were decked out in designer gowns and tuxedos. The scene was set for Robert Mitchell's grand announcement. He would publicly disinherit Isabella, stripping her of any claim to the family fortune. But what Robert didn't know was that Isabella had prepared for this moment. She had gathered evidence of his humiliations, recording every word, every instance where he had belittled her, and stored it in a secure location. When the moment came, and Robert publicly declared that Isabella would receive nothing from her grandmother's estate, Isabella did not flinch. She raised her glass, thanked him for making the humiliation public, and walked out. But the real drama was yet to unfold. As Isabella walked out of the Ritz-Carlton ballroom, the murmurs from the crowd followed her. But she kept her head held high. Her father's voice, dripping with disdain, echoed in her ears as she made her exit. Isabella will receive nothing from Eleanor's estate, not $1. She never deserved the Mitchell inheritance. She could hear the whispers, the uncomfortable chuckles of family members, and the way her sister, Victoria, joined in with a cruel applause. But Isabella remained calm, her movements deliberate as she left the building and stepped into the cool night air. She could almost hear the devastation that her father's announcement had caused, but she knew the storm was only just beginning. The next 2 days felt like a blur. Isabella didn't check her phone at first, deliberately avoiding the flood of messages she knew awaited her. She was content in her apartment, reflecting on her grandmother's teachings, finding solace in the portrait of Eleanor that hung on her wall, and preparing for what was to come. Crawford, her grandmother's attorney, had been in touch. The legal documentation was already in place. Isabella's calm, composed exit had not been in vain. It was all part of the plan that Eleanor had carefully orchestrated, a plan that was now about to unfold. Crawford had already begun the legal process, and the necessary documentation was being filed. What Robert Mitchell didn't know was that his public declaration had triggered a legal clause written into Eleanor's will, one that Isabella had been quietly preparing for. Eleanor's moral character clause, as it was called, was not just a piece of legal language. It was a powerful tool, one that Isabella's father had underestimated. This clause stated that any beneficiary who publicly humiliated or attempted to disinherit another family member through social coercion would forfeit their rights to the inheritance. Eleanor had always believed that the true measure of wealth was not money, but moral integrity. She had placed her faith in Isabella, the one family member who had shown kindness and compassion rather than a desire for power or prestige. Within hours of the gala, Crawford's team had begun gathering the necessary documentation: security footage from the event, witness statements from the 50 guests present, and the recordings Isabella had made over the months. These were the pieces of the puzzle that would lead to the ultimate confrontation. As Isabella sat in her apartment, sipping tea and reflecting on the decisions she had made, she knew her father's empire was about to crumble. The following morning, Robert left a voicemail for Isabella. His voice was different, less confident, more weary. "Your tantrum changes nothing," he said, trying to assert control. "We're updating the distribution documents. It doesn't matter. You'll get nothing." Isabella simply ignored the message. He had no idea what was coming. When the family group chat exploded with messages, Isabella couldn't help but observe the chaos unfolding. Victoria, ever the strategist, tried to salvage the situation by sending messages calling Isabella's departure dramatic and pathetic. But it was her father's message that stood out. "The decision is final," Robert wrote. "Isabella made her choices." To him, it was over. But to Isabella, it had only just begun. Later that day, Isabella received another email from Victoria. It was a final attempt at persuasion, though it reeked of desperation. "Stop being a child," it read. "You knew this was coming. Just accept the token amount Grandma left you and stop embarrassing yourself." Isabella, still calm and unflinching, forwarded the email to Crawford. He responded quickly, his confidence unwavering. "Perfect. Please save all communications." They were ready. That evening, as Isabella prepared for the formal reading of Eleanor's will, she couldn't help but feel a sense of quiet satisfaction. Her grandmother had thought of everything. She had planned for every eventuality, even the possibility of Robert's ruthless behavior. Eleanor had set the stage for justice to be served, and Isabella was the instrument of that justice. The morning of the will reading, Isabella arrived early, dressed in the same simple black dress she had worn to the gala. She knew this day would change everything. Crawford met her at his firm's office, and they reviewed the final details of the legal documents one last time. The full terms of the will would be revealed during the reading, but they both knew that the moral character clause would trigger the moment Robert's public humiliation of Isabella was acknowledged. At 2 p.m., Robert and Victoria arrived at Crawford's office, their confidence unmistakable. They had no idea what awaited them. The room was filled with a sense of anticipation, as family members, board members from Mitchell Holdings, and a few lawyers gathered in silence. Isabella took her seat at the far end of the table, watching her father and sister as they took their places. They had no idea that their world was about to implode. Crawford stood at the front of the room, his calm demeanor contrasting sharply with the tension in the air. "We are here for the formal reading of Eleanor Hayes Mitchell's will," he began, his voice steady. Robert shifted uncomfortably in his seat, his eyes darting around the room. He was beginning to sense that something was wrong, but it was too late to turn back now. "Before we begin," Crawford continued, "I must note that Mrs. Mitchell requested this reading be video recorded for legal documentation." He glanced at Robert and Victoria, who exchanged a confused look. "Are there any objections?" Crawford asked. Robert's voice, laced with impatience, was the first to break the silence. "Get on with it," he said. Crawford activated the recording system, and the room fell into a tense hush as the screen flickered to life. Eleanor appeared, looking as dignified as ever, wearing her signature pearl necklace and a navy suit. Her voice filled the room, strong and clear. "My dear family," she began, her gaze piercing through the camera. "If you're watching this, then I am gone, and you are gathered to divide what I've left behind. But first, you must understand why I structured my will as I have." Robert's face grew pale. Victoria sat up straighter, her phone forgotten in her hands. Eleanor's voice continued, unwavering. "I've spent 40 years on the bench, watching how money corrupts family bonds. I've seen greed turn love into litigation. I refuse to let my legacy become another cautionary tale." Isabella could feel her heart racing as she watched her grandmother speak, knowing that this was the moment her father's fate was sealed. Eleanor's words were not just a moral judgment, they were legally binding. The room remained still as the video played on. Eleanor's recorded image continued to fill the screen, her voice steady and resolute. "Therefore," she said, "I have included in my will what I call a moral character clause. It's quite simple. Any beneficiary who publicly humiliates, demeans, or attempts to disinherit another family member forfeits all claims to my estate." Isabella could see her father's knuckles tighten around the edge of the table. The color drained from his face as he understood the gravity of the situation. "This forfeiture is automatic and irreversible upon documented proof of such behavior witnessed by 20 or more individuals." Isabella held her breath as Eleanor's voice continued, outlining the provisions of the clause. "The inheritance will transfer immediately to the wronged party, not as punishment, but as protection for those who are treated with respect and fairness." The weight of her grandmother's words hung heavy in the room, especially as Robert's face contorted with anger. He had assumed he would simply claim the inheritance, but now the consequences of his own actions were closing in on him. The family members who had been silent up until this point now began to murmur, realizing the full extent of what had transpired. Eleanor's voice, as calm as ever, spoke again. "This clause is not just about money, but about what kind of people we are. I believe that inheritance should go to those who value family over fortune, who treat each other with respect, regardless of career choices or lifestyle differences. Robert tried to speak, but his words faltered. He shot a glance at Victoria, whose expression was now filled with alarm. The evidence was mounting, and they both knew it. Now, Robert, Eleanor's voice continued, I'm sure you're aware that the events of 2 nights ago, at the Ritz-Carlton, triggered this clause. I have proof of the public humiliation you inflicted upon your daughter. The recordings, the witness statements, and the security footage from the event, all of it is here, as well as your own words. The screen flickered, and the voice of Isabella's father filled the room, clear as day. Isabella will receive nothing from Eleanor's estate, not $1. She never deserved the Mitchell inheritance. Robert's voice echoed across the room, his earlier confidence now replaced with frustration and confusion. Victoria, who had been visibly tense, suddenly stood up, her voice shrill with disbelief. This is ridiculous! That was about inheritance decisions, not about Grandma's will. But Crawford was prepared. Mr. Mitchell, he said, his tone calm but firm, you specifically referenced Eleanor's estate. We have recordings, witness statements, and security footage confirming your actions. Isabella watched her father's face contort with rage as the implications set in. Victoria, ever the strategist, tried to salvage the situation, her voice trembling. This is a setup. This was all planned. Crawford turned to her with unwavering composure. No, Miss Mitchell, a setup requires deception. What you're seeing is the result of your father's own choices. Her father's fury intensified as he shot to his feet, his chair scraping loudly across the floor. You can't do this, he roared. This is all just a game to you. I'm afraid it's not, Crawford replied, unfazed. The will is clear. The clause has been activated. And as for the consequences... He paused and began to methodically lay out the final distributions, his voice cutting through the rising tension in the room. Because of the triggering of the moral character clause, Robert Mitchell will forfeit his share of the inheritance. $15 million in cash and securities will be transferred to Isabella Mitchell. Robert's jaw clenched, but he remained silent. The room was still, and everyone was absorbing the shock of the revelation. Crawford continued. Victoria Mitchell, as co-conspirator in the public humiliation of Isabella, will forfeit $5 million, which will also transfer to Isabella. Victoria's face flushed with anger, but she said nothing, unable to counter the mounting evidence. She had not spoken out against her father's actions. Instead, she had joined in, applauding his cruel disinheritance of Isabella. The most significant change, Crawford went on, is the transfer of Eleanor's 30% stake in Mitchell Holdings, valued at approximately $150 million. This will be transferred from Robert Mitchell to Isabella Mitchell, effective immediately. The room erupted in whispers. Several board members from Mitchell Holdings, who had been silent up until this point, were visibly stunned. One of them, Harold Brennan, stood up and looked directly at Robert. Robert, you only hold 35% yourself. With Isabella's new holdings, she is now the largest shareholder, and she controls the board votes. Robert's face turned an unhealthy shade of red as the weight of his actions crushed him. This is theft, he screamed. This is an outrage. No, Crawford responded, his voice calm but filled with finality. This is consequence. The legal fallout from Robert's actions continued to unfold as the meeting progressed. More of the board members stood up, clearly uncomfortable with Robert's behavior and the ripple effects it was having on the company's reputation. As the motion to remove Robert from his position as CEO gained traction, his hold on the company began to slip. The once untouchable empire was crumbling, and Isabella was standing at the center of the storm, unwavering. Her father tried to rally support, but it was too late. The damage had been done. With her new stake in Mitchell Holdings, Isabella had the power to reshape the company. But she wasn't interested in rebuilding her father's empire. She was interested in protecting her grandmother's legacy and ensuring that the values of family, respect, and integrity were upheld. The chaos in the conference room swirled around Isabella like a storm, but she remained calm. Her father's outbursts grew louder, his threats more desperate, but none of it mattered anymore. Isabella had already won. The family's true nature had been exposed, and the empire that Robert had spent his life building was slipping through his fingers. The room was filled with the sound of whispers as the board members processed what had just been revealed. Isabella, now the largest shareholder of Mitchell Holdings, had the power to replace her father as CEO. Robert's once unshakable authority had been destroyed in a matter of hours, his position no longer tenable. Harold Brennan, the lead board member, was already making calls, organizing an emergency board meeting for that afternoon. The board members had seen enough. They no longer trusted Robert's judgment, and his actions had irrevocably damaged the company's reputation. Within hours, the motion to remove Robert as CEO was passed. The board was unanimous in their decision. Robert Mitchell, once the powerful patriarch of the family, was ousted from his position. Victoria, too, found herself powerless. Her lack of qualifications for the VP role had become glaringly obvious. She had never earned her position based on merit. It had always been because of her father's favoritism. The company was now in the hands of those who would focus on building its future, not using it to prop up their egos. Isabella, in contrast, remained quiet and composed. The battle had been won, but her victory wasn't about revenge. It was about securing her grandmother's legacy. Eleanor had always believed in the importance of integrity, family, and respect. Isabella would honor that, even if it meant walking away from the wealth her father had so desperately clung to. As the board meeting concluded, and Robert and Victoria sat in stunned silence, Isabella stepped outside to take a deep breath. The air felt different now. It wasn't just the scent of change, it was the weight of everything that had been revealed. The truth had been laid bare for all to see, and her family's mask had slipped. She had stood up for herself when no one else would, and it had made all the difference. Isabella knew that the road ahead wouldn't be easy. She had fought not just for her inheritance, but for her dignity, for the chance to build something of her own. And now, with her newfound control of Mitchell Holdings, she could do just that. But more importantly, she had learned that true wealth wasn't found in money. It was found in the ability to protect your own integrity and to stand up for what you believe in, even when it feels like the whole world is against you. Back at her Brooklyn apartment, Isabella allowed herself a moment of reflection. Her grandmother's portrait still hung on the wall, a silent witness to everything that had transpired. She ran a finger along the frame, remembering Eleanor's words. True wealth is not measured in square footage or stock portfolios. It had taken a long time for Isabella to understand the full meaning of those words. But now, as she looked around her, at the art her students had created, at the foundation she had started in her grandmother's name, she realized that her grandmother had been right all along. The art world, her students, and the future she had promised to protect were worth more than any family fortune. She had built something far more valuable than money, a legacy rooted in love, respect, and integrity. The next few months were a whirlwind. Isabella focused on the Eleanor Hayes Mitchell Foundation for Arts Education, which was now fully funded thanks to her inheritance. She had poured the money into scholarships for underprivileged art students, giving them the opportunity to pursue their dreams. The foundation's first exhibition was a resounding success. The gallery space, once an abandoned warehouse, was now alive with the vibrant works of young artists whose lives had been changed by Isabella's vision. Her father's downfall, though hard to ignore, no longer held the same power over her. Robert's bankruptcy filing came soon after his removal as CEO, a result of his reckless actions and the loss of the family's reputation. His former employees, once loyal to him, began to distance themselves, and investors pulled out of his projects. Mitchell Holdings, once a shining example of wealth and power, was now floundering without its leader. Victoria, too, faced the fallout from their family's public disgrace. Her lack of qualifications for her position had caught up with her, and within weeks, she was quietly reassigned to a junior role. Her father's wealth couldn't protect her from the consequences of their actions. Despite everything, Isabella remained calm. She had no desire for vengeance, only for justice. And justice had been served in the most unexpected way. She had learned that the greatest inheritance wasn't the wealth passed down from generations, but the wisdom to know what truly matters in life. Family wasn't about blood or money. It was about respect, love, and the ability to protect yourself from those who would diminish your light. One day, after another successful exhibition, a reporter from the Hartford Courant approached Isabella. "Any comment on your father's recent bankruptcy filing?" they asked, holding a microphone in front of her. Isabella smiled softly, the memories of her family's betrayal still fresh, but no longer painful. "I wish him well," she said simply. "Everyone deserves a chance to rebuild." The reporter nodded, and Isabella turned away, knowing that her journey was far from over. But as she looked at the young artists around her, the ones whose dreams she had helped make possible, she knew that she had made the right choice. She had created something lasting, something that would continue to grow and inspire for years to come. Her phone buzzed as she walked through the gallery, but she ignored it. It was from her father, asking if they could meet. She smiled wistfully as she turned it off. Maybe one day, she thought to herself. But not yet. Isabella knew that she had found something far more valuable than a billion-dollar empire. The peace of knowing that she had stood up for herself, for her dreams, and for what was right. If this story resonated with you, if you've ever been told that your dreams weren't practical, that your worth was measured in dollars instead of heart, share your story in the comments below. Remember, you are worthy of everything you dream of. Don't forget to like, share, and subscribe for more stories of justice, self-discovery, and the power of standing up for what's right.